In the summer of 1787, the United States was in crisis. With the end of the War of Independence, military contracts were suddenly suspended and armies were abruptly disbanded, leading states to unexpectedly default on their debts. Economic depression spread, unemployment soared, and crime was on the rise. And in a bid to stem the tide of rising crime, one state passed what it called the wheelbarrow law. For centuries, the monarchies of the West had punished felons in public. They were forced into the stocks, ferociously flogged, amputated, and executed before sometimes willing but more often unwilling crowds, all for the sake of shaming them for their crimes and publicizing the power of the king or queen. And in these monarch-free United States, however, there was no need to prop up the power of a hereditary potentate, so the rehabilitative power of shame was put to good public use. And the wheelbarrow law mandated that felons would be shamed not with purely performative torture, but with a profoundly public, hard labor that would serve civic needs. And it was this law and this form of public shaming that made a group of Pennsylvanian Quakers gather in Benjamin Franklin's living room. And it was there in 1787 that Benjamin Rush, a physician who was a founding father and is recognized as the father of American psychiatry, read a paper protesting against this law and proposing a radically new, profoundly private form of punishment. He saw everything from the gallows to wheelbarrows as inhumane and public shame as deeply ineffective for inducing change in a felon. He saw these humiliations as indignities that would build resentments, foster a desire for vengeance, and harden antinomian and antisocial felons so that they would almost inevitably re-offend. Instead, he had a vision for rehabilitation through a process of introspection, where privacy and seclusion and silence and solitude would force felons to brood upon their failures and muse upon the possibility of improving their character. He called for the abolition of public labors and for the construction of a state-sponsored house of repentance. Rush believed that a delicate blend of privacy and terror would stimulate repentance and suggested that these new prisons, to be most effective, should be frightening in their appearance. In the presence of Benjamin Franklin, he said, "Let a large house be erected in a remote part of the state, and let the avenue to this house be rendered difficult and gloomy by mountains and morasses. Let its doors be made of iron, and let the grating occasioned by opening and shutting them be increased by an echo from a neighboring mountain that shall extend and continue a sound that shall deeply pierce the soul. And to increase the horror of this abode of discipline and misery, let it be called by a name that shall import its design." And though he does not offer a name not too much later, on the basis of his claims and advocacy, the Eastern State Penitentiary opened its doors, a place which today one can tour and see how terrifying it must have been. So it is a matter of record that it was these Puritans who seem to have invented and first experimented with solitary confinement as a means for engendering regret and generating penance. But it seems equally clear that though it was a combination of Puritans and Pennsylvanian Quakers who introduced punitive solitude to these shores, it was a cause inspired by the Hebrew Bible. Because this morning we read of how the Metzora, afflicted with a condition as a consequence of sin, was expelled from the population. Hu badad yeshev, he shall sit alone. Michutz l'machaneh moshavo, his dwelling shall be outside the camp. And though for some medieval masters his quarantine was due to medical concerns amid Sarat's contagious nature, for Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky the real reason has nothing to do with biological infectivity and everything to do with the spiritual power of solitude. In his words, Yerachok mibnei Adam, he shall be apart from other people, of hitboduduto, and his seclusion, he shetaviu lidei tshuva, shall stimulate contrition. So for centuries, Before Rush, the biblical text thrusts seclusion upon a sinner to induce the industry of the inner self. The biblical text envisions solitude and its attendant reflection as far more corrective than shame and far more humane. But there is a dark side to this cure, the system invented by heaven and implemented in Pennsylvania. For though solitude may be more effective and more humane than punitive shame in excess, it can cause immeasurable pain and become the consummate form of torture. Decades after its founding, Alexis de Tocqueville came to see the American penitentiary system in action, and while he revered its humane motives, he lamented its effects in practice. He agreed in principle that solitude causes a criminal to reflect, but he said absolute solitude, if nothing interrupts it, is beyond the strength of man. It destroys the criminal without intermission and without pity. It does not reform, it kills. And in fact, 60 years later, in 1890, the Supreme Court ruled that too much solitary confinement was cruel and unusual and violated the Constitution. We are social animals, and we all now know how destabilizing and dislocating and agonizing and distressing enforced isolation can be. And our tradition is not unaware of the dark side of seclusion. In fact, for a whole range of our commentators, the pain of isolation is not incidental to the Metzora's penitence. In the words of our sages in the Talmud, Hu yavdil ben ish le'ishto, the criminal here alienated husbands and wives, ben ish l're'ehu, friends and neighbors, lefikach amra Torah, so the Torah teaches, badad yeshev, he shall sit alone. The sinner afflicted with sarat, guilty of a divisive invective, must be made to feel the private pain that their defamation caused, to see the trauma of isolation before they can harness the power of solitude to improve the state of their souls. For though our faith does see solitude as an avenue for improving the self, it also sees solidarity as necessary and essentially redemptive. In the words of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Judaism is not about the lonely soul. It is about the bonds that bind us to one another. Our faith, he says, sanctifies relationships, builds communities, and turns our gaze outward from self to other, giving emotional resonance to altruism and energizing the better angels of our nature. Shame is inhumane, but isolation is a dangerous place to be, and in excess, it can strip us of our humanity, as God himself said, Lo tov heyot ha'adam levado, it is not good for human beings to be alone. Being solitary may lead, if done with care, to penance, but it can never lead to redemption. For that, we need solidarity. And now I'll share a letter that was sent to the National Council of Young Israel earlier this week from one of the aid workers on the ground in the refugee camps in Budapest. Dear National Council, he wrote, I just got off the phone from speaking with Mordechai and wanted to update you and thank you. After his wife passed away a few years ago, he's been a single parent to his 8-year-old son, Raphael. And after spending the last 3 weeks in 3 different refugee camps within Ukraine, Mordechai and Raphael finally crossed the border today and arrived in Budapest. I spoke to Mordechai for over an hour last night. I asked him where he's staying and eating in Budapest, and he said that a rabbi had arranged everything for them, including accommodation and meals. He then told me that he plans to take Raphael to the store in Budapest tomorrow to buy some clothes and also some Lego, which Raphael loves and misses very much. I asked him if he has the money to go shopping, and he told me that on Purim, after the Suda, a rabbi gave out money to all the families in the refugee camp, and he's going to use some of that money to go shopping tomorrow. He said he had not even counted the money until today because it had no value when he was in Ukraine. It is thanks to your idea and support that we made this collection, and until tonight I didn't fully realize how important this collection was. Thank you. Thank you. As so many of our brothers and sisters, men, women, children of all ages are trapped in camps not of their own choosing, in many cases far away from their loved ones, let us continue to do all that we can to support them. Yesterday I sent a note around to the shul saying that we, together with 89 other communities, had joined the Shuls for Ukraine campaign, with a goal for us to send $15,000 to refugees to provide kosher meals and assist with other needs. And I appeal to you for your continued help. There is a link beneath this video and a link in the email which this video came to you in. Though we cannot relieve these refugees of their isolation, we can stand with them in solidarity. Though we cannot relieve them of their loneliness, we can remind them that they are not alone. I thank you for your help, and I wish you a Shavua Tov.